I'm here with Natalie Barker-Rutchi, which I just tried to learn the pronunciation of your name properly, but hopefully I did not butcher it. How are you?
Great, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Hmm?
I'm doing great, and I think we're having a great little chat before this about the crazy world that we're living in right now. All things from political climate to gymnastics to what's happening right now, and I think I'm very excited to talk to you about a lot of your expertise area, especially as it kind of comes around the different, socio, cultural factors in gymnastics. I think you have a phenomenal book that I've been reading through with Gretchen Kerr and a couple other editors. But I think now more than ever, we are living in a time where change is happening very rapidly in the sport, and we are having some really important conversations around these topics that you're an expert in. So I'd like to just have you on for a while and chat about, I guess, the disciplinary actions that we have in the sport today. So can you start by maybe giving people a little bit of your background who may be unfamiliar with your work or with your research, and then we'll kind of dive into some topics from there?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I am a sports scientist, so I've got I'm educated in sports science from bachelor, master to a PhD. I've moved around the globe for a little bit, so I did some studies in New Zealand, some in Australia, and I ended up in this country, Sweden, which is not my homeland. So I'm originally from Switzerland, and my research is largely on women's artistic gymnastics, but I've also researched other similar sports, such as synchronized swimming and figure skating, where we also hear similar reports of abuse, those we're hearing in gymnastics. So I mainly focus on the high level of sport, or at least the sub-elite level of sport, because I'm particularly interested in how sport participation shapes the individuals, the athletes, whether they are children or older, and also how that influence continues once the athletes retire from sport. And I take a sociological perspective mostly, but at times it's also been a learning perspective, so more a pedagogical or educational perspective. So what do these people, or what do these children or athletes learn? Who do they become as individuals or as people, which is quite clear in the research, continues beyond the athletic career. So, and I think this is also what we're hearing now in the statements by so many former gymnasts, how their experiences in gymnastics, continues to shape them or influence them, even though they're 15 years out of the sport or they've become parents and so on. So this is really not something that can be ignored, or it is something that has a very long-term effect. In my university employment, I've been involved mainly in coach education. So I ran a bachelor program in sports coaching. And of course, the perspective on how does sport affect athletes and how can we protect athletes was something that I have continuously tried to teach or discuss or have the students reflect over. So.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And something I find so fascinating about your work and about many other people's work is really the gravity of the impact, as you said, of what our example as a coach, as a parent, as a role model in a young athlete's lives, how significantly that shapes their cultural norms, the way they approach not only their own sense of self, but also the way they interact with the world. And I find that one of the main reasons I'm still involved in coaching and I care so much about this sport is because of when gymnasts have the right environment, the right support, and someone to teach them such important foundational values, they go on to become an incredible human being who has really great characteristics that shape the world in a positive way. And the flip side of that coin that I think is the concern we're seeing now is that when maybe the environment they grow up in or the coaching style they're a part of or the social norms of their gym around maybe don't speak up and don't talk about your injuries or don't talk back to the coach or you don't really that conditioned of silence that we have so much, unfortunately, sometimes happening, they go on to develop a really distorted view of themselves and a distorted view of the world that's frankly scary, you know what I mean, about what they feel is true about their own sense of self, body, the way they interact with people. So I think we have a really important role to drive them down a really healthy path of learning positive values and positive interactions with the sport. And there is so much amazing that, there's so many amazing things that can come from gymnastics if people are just put in a really good environment, a really good role model. So I don't know. I think your research does center around that, but do you have any more thoughts on that first before we maybe dive into some specific topics?
No, I'm just thinking that that is an aspect that is very, at least in public, not known, because the athletes disappear. So they're in the public eye when they are competitive, also compete, and often in a very positive light. And I think in gymnastics in particular, the representation in the media is, you know, they're superstars, they smile, they look amazing, they do amazing things. And then so there's behind the curtain perspective, not only while they're in sport, but certainly once they have retired. It's not in the public eye. And it is also an area in research that has not received so much attention, at least not a research with athletes that perhaps are 20 years out to actually discuss with them, who are you now and how affected, or how has sport affected you. So I think there's still some gaps in knowledge that would do well to be covered. And perhaps now with athletes speaking out, we hear at least a little bit more about that, what life is like once they are retired and out of the public eye.
Yeah, something I'm always thinking about as a coach, and I'm concerned about as a coach, as someone who really deals with athletes, you know, on a regular basis, is I think oftentimes when you're in a large gym or you're part of a large organization, it's very easy to just focus on the athletes who are available, that are not injured, that are doing well, that are right in front of you, rightfully so, because you're trying to progress. But I think oftentimes we really underestimate what happens to those athletes that maybe get an injury and are out of the gym for 6 to 8 weeks, or they decide to slowly kind of just transition out of the sport because they're mentally burnt out, or you know, other people who, like you said, retire and move on. I think, unfortunately, we don't really continue to see the effects of what we have done as a coach, as a parent, as a team of people around that athlete. I don't think we see the negative impact that sometimes comes out from their career when they're maybe not having the best experience. And unfortunately, it takes years of waiting and waiting. And then finally, something like our situation where a bunch of people speak up. But I think a lot of coaches, unfortunately, don't see, you know, I see a lot of athletes who are injured and have, you know, back fractures, surgeries, and their demeanor and their interaction with themselves and the world is very, very different than what you see as that bubbly, happy, competing personality. And I think we really, unfortunately, need to have a harder look at those athletes that are either injured or burn out or don't do that, and talk about what are your experiences and what are you going through now, so we can learn about how we can better interact with the athletes when they're in front of us.
Yeah, and I think it also points to not the organizational responsibility. So there have been stories now of athletes that have had to fund therapies or counseling of some description for many years, and the gymnastics, also the organizations behind the abuse that was caused, they are not involved. So I think there's also that side of things that perhaps needs to be tackled in a better way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like not only the athlete mental and physical wellness during their competitive career or during their time, but also, are we setting these athletes up to be healthy and happy beyond their years in gymnastics? Because we know that the physical toll, the mental toll, and the emotional toll doesn't stop just because you retire or because you choose to move on to another part of your life. It's a piece of you, for good or for better, or for better or for worse, I should say.
Yeah, for sure.
I think an important place to talk, we had an email exchange for last month, and there were so many amazing topics we could dive into and talk about. But I think the one we'd like to maybe focus on today, and maybe we can start from the younger years in gymnastics, of like the environment and the conditioning. But I think this concept of discipline and this concept of, you know, I think it's important to highlight that it's so important to have structure in gymnastics because of the safety aspect and the ability to have meaningful practices that move towards goals that are important. Like, we want to make sure that we're developing people who have a sense of respect and they understand these values that we want to teach them. But I think we unfortunately see a far cry from that, which is very much a power struggle and a demand of control, and that people are falling in line with, almost military style discipline. And it unfortunately conditions this at a very young age, conditions these athletes sometimes to be not speaking up and to be very just do what I say and to not have a voice. And I don't have the experience as a young female in the sport, but from a lot of friends of mine who did, they sometimes felt as though they were, conditioned to be silent and conditioned to just listen to orders at all times and not speak up. And it cost them massively down the road when they didn't speak up about an injury, or they felt intimidated by their coach and they didn't want to have their own voice or a sense of autonomy. So I guess, can you share maybe either your perspective or some literature perspectives on why gymnastics has this point made sometimes about the conditioning of not speaking up, or the do as I say at all costs kind of, and then we'll kind of maybe explore some more there.
Yeah, I will try to do that. And so I think gymnastics has been very good at disciplining gymnasts. And what you've said about the authoritarian relationship and the not having a voice and so on. But I have also tried to research and demonstrate how without those extreme conditions of discipline, there is a disciplining going on at all times that where I mean, generally in society, but in gymnastics as well, or in sport, are not so aware of. And that basis allows for more extreme forms of discipline and control and manipulation. And that is also something that perhaps later on in our discussion today, we can look at, well, how can we tackle this basic foundation of discipline that goes on in any case, because we're doing organized competitive Olympic sport. So that's perhaps where I would like to start. The work that I've been doing also the research that I've been doing in trying to demonstrate this more basic foundation of discipline, I've drawn on a French theorist that has conceptualized how modern society operates to make us people orderly and productive. So productive in the sense that we do what we're supposed to do at work or in school or in hospitals. And this philosopher from France his name is Michel Foucault. And he developed this concept of technologies of dominance to explain how modern society operates. And he contrasted that organization, if you like, to historically when a king or a queen had that type of power over people to decide all the way to you are going to live or die. So they had control over everything. And historically, this type of control and power disappeared to the modern forms of governance that we know now, where there are obviously laws, rules, and regulations that create that order and control in our society. Some people abuse that, of course, but and there's also a type of policing going on to make sure that people stick to those rules. But there's a lot of rules in our society that are not written down, that are unspoken, that tell us what's okay to do and what's not okay. And these might be cultural, could possibly also be religious. But in women's artistic gymnastics, I think there's lots of commentaries now that speak about these unspoken ideals or cultural constituents that shape the gymnastics context, all the way from body ideals to ideals of how to perform and so on. They're not written down in the code of points, for instance. Right. It doesn't say there that you need to be young or that you need to be skinny, for instance, to use that as an example. Of course, the code of points outlines the technical performance-based rules, and those are not really negotiable. That makes women's artistic gymnastics the sport that makes it an Olympic sport. And it's those unspoken rules that Foucault, the theorist, has analyzed and researched, and I have tried to use that theoretical lens or that type of understanding to look at women's artistic gymnastics. And by doing that, I have been able to show some of those much more hidden rules or regulations that shape the gymnasts, but also others. The parents could be named here, also coaches and stakeholders in organizations. So that's sort of the starting point of what I hope I can explain. So several aspects of Foucault's theory are important in terms of how we classify, how we discipline, and importantly, how we become shaped as individualized as individuals. And he spoke of this normalization. So this is a process of where we internalize these cultural or unspoken rules, and then we live by them, and often we're not aware of that we're doing that. So we can perhaps also compare it to boys and girls learn very early on what's right for girls to do and what's right for boys to do, or what's not right to do. So boys shouldn't cry. That rule or that ideal is not really written down anywhere, but everybody kind of knows that at some point, and it shapes how we deal with emotions, for instance. So in gymnastics, we can see that very strongly, I would say, globally also, that this isn't a cultural thing that applies to US only, or that it's different in Germany. Like, the sport is globally culturalized, if you like, and has a very set foundation on how it's being done. And the way that we can see this type of discipline is in gymnastics in different ways. So, for instance, this is also what Foucault has theorized, is that how the space is organized. The gymnasium, if you look at it, it's often quite similarly set up around the world. If you imagine a gym, usually the square floor is set in the middle, and the other apparatus is distributed around it. And what that allows is that the coach is usually in that middle space and very quickly can see what's going on. So the coach might be able to see the gymnasts on the bars. There's also gymnasts maybe on the balance beam and some are on the floor. So that allows a heightened control, if you like. The space and how it's organized and how the individuals are distributed in that space gives the coach an advantage, or a vantage point from which the gymnast is seen at all times, even if perhaps the coach is not directly coaching the gymnast on the beam, but is actually with the girls on the floor. So it allows a very limited, unobserved time for the gymnast, or uncontrolled time where, mistakes or misbehavior, if that even exists in gymnastics, can be picked straight away. An aspect of this type of disciplining that we very much take for granted, because there is also a good reasoning why the space is organized in the way that it is, that it also, for instance, doesn't allow for disturbances or intrusion from the outside. It's a closed space, then often enhanced by rules such as that parents aren't allowed to come in, no spectators, or there's perhaps only certain times when this is allowed, etc. So I'm sure you can relate to that. The space and the distribution within the space is one aspect that affords the coach an advantage, if you like, and of course this has a very productive effect, a positive effect. This can also be a safety issue, but it does also have this effect of being observed at all times, of being controlled at all times, and if it is a context of abuse, then it can also be a manipulation at all times. That verbal abuse can be hit, etc.
Yeah.
So I think that's one aspect that for me is a sort of basic discipline foundation that coaches, parents, others need to be should be aware of, because it can lead to further discipline or even abuse. But I think when we start to talk about, well, how can we reduce the effects of that type of disciplining? What can coaches do to sort of counter this spatial effect that is built into gymnastics gymnasium, for instance? There's also what Foucault calls a control of activity, so that, for instance, in gymnastics, this is also very strong, that because a gymnast cannot perform a skill in any way, there are technical demands. They are part of the code of points. This has effects in competition through judging if a skill is not performed in the way that it's supposed to be. So this control of activity means that to learn a skill, it's often very structured. We don't just practice the somersault on the balance beam. There is a progression with often also instances of control or quality control. Perhaps the exercises that the gymnast performs in this progression are set up in a way so that the coach can see, provide feedback. Again, this is very productive. This makes sense. But also means that there is a minute, detailed controlling going on as the gymnast learns the skill. So there's nothing is left to chance. And again, there are positive sides to that, but it creates further possibilities for someone to control, possibly manipulate what's going on through feedback mainly. Often it's also, at least that is also what my research has shown, that for a gymnast to move from one level of learning a skill to a more difficult level, the coach makes that decision. So now, you've shown to me that you can do this. Now you must go on, or you can go on to, let's say, doing the somersault from doing it on a line to on a balance beam that is still low with a mat over it. And then, these kinds of progressions that are very structured, they allow minute observations to make sure that the gymnast learns the skill in the technique that she's supposed to be able to perform it in the end. And that is closely tied to the code of points. So while the code of points does allow freedom, you don't have to, as a gymnast, learn certain skills, even though some of it may be prescribed at the lower levels. But the code of points does prescribe how you are due to perform a handstand. And if you don't, then in a competition, you'll get deductions. So that, to me, is tied to this control of activity and progression that we as coaches, or the gymnast, does need to learn that skill in the right way, so that in the end it doesn't cause a deduction in a competition. That has also effects on the gymnast, so that to be able to then learn a skill or perform a skill in the right way, the gymnast herself needs to get control over her body, or command the body, so that she is able to perform the handstand in this right position. Right. So that kind of external control that is delivered, if you like, through having the progressions, the repetitions, the way a skill is built up until the gymnast can perform it in competition, also requires the gymnast herself to take charge of her body and limbs, and of course that is also a question of building up strength and coordination and so on. But what I have observed in my research, where this becomes very obvious, is when a gymnast has to connect certain skills. So this could be flick-flack somersault on the beam, or this could be let's say a flick-flack and a jump, which are two different types of skills. And that really requires a gymnast to be in control of her body, because that's difficult to do.
Yeah.
That can cause a lot of frustration. So the gymnast knows that I need to have this control over my body. It is difficult, of course, and on the balance beam, this is even trickier to do. That type of control that I'm talking about, the disciplining to be productive and orderly, that's an example of how the gymnast then ends up having to internalize that, to self-manage that discipline. And over the years of having to do that, that does have that sort of effect of internal effect, that I need to be controlled, as it's not only something or someone else has that demands that discipline or has that control over me. I myself need to have that control. Of course, that's in any sport. This is not something that happens in only gymnastics. It may be perhaps more extreme in gymnastics, because the handstand does need to be performed in a certain way. In some sports, I'm thinking football, it doesn't perhaps matter so much how you run around the pitch. In gymnastics, it does matter. Like, you do need to walk across the beam in a certain way. You do need to do that cartwheel in a certain way, at least if you want to avoid deductions in the competition. So there's self-control that it causes over the time. While, of course, this is productive, this does achieve the end of not having deductions in a competition. And this may also be useful in life outside of sport, to have that sort of competence, kinesthetic competence perhaps. But researchers have very much also problematize that, and I go as far as to say the more competent an athlete is, the more elite an athlete is, the more it means that this athlete is able to control his or her own movements.
Yeah.
So in terms of that discipline that has also been connected to not speaking out, of being submissive, of perhaps not recognizing your own pain, could be disliking something and then speaking out to a coach or somebody else about it. I think this is definitely connected in terms of I need to discipline myself in order to perform in certain ways.
Right.
And to me, while that is, I keep repeating myself, but while this is productive to achieve the end, and this has benefits, I think this can be also dangerous. And I think as sports coaches, if we can be aware of that, we can build in other exercises, we can build in certain feedback, we can give gymnasts slack when perhaps it's appropriate, so that this type of disciplining doesn't become, or doesn't reach that end where the gymnast becomes a dupe in the system. And I think that's really important to recognize, especially also because I think if you also there's a risk that we take this for too granted, and recognize it. So now I don't know if I've made any sense, but
that was, no, trust me, that was fascinating. Like I was just sitting here listening and learning, and I had like 75 follow-up questions I could ask. But the thing that pops out the most to me is first attacking the question of, okay, so when do we cross the line of the appropriate level of influence and control and guidance for safety and for technical development and for making progress, especially when the athletes are maybe on the younger, age of the sport? When do we cross the line as sport coaches or as parents or as people who are, stakeholders of too much control and being hypercritical or hyper controlling of all of the aspects of the athlete's life? Because what I see on the surface level is you dissolve that sense of autonomy, you dissolve that sense of self, regulation, and being able to speak up for your own well-being in the sport. Because as a coach, what we're trying to do is, at the value level, teach them a set of values they can take with them for their life. But we're trying to foster the athlete to be in control of their own life and their own gymnastics, and be responsible and be accountable for what they're doing. Like you said, to not only technically control themselves for skills, but then also be in control of their own training and try to be disciplined about their recovery and their timeline. So in your opinion, where does that line cross from an appropriate amount of partnership between a coach and an athlete and the right amount of input or control or guiding them along a skill progression technically correct, to overstepping the boundary of hyper managing their life and saying everything about their practice or everything about the way they interact with their sport? And that's when it, in my opinion, becomes concerning. For they don't speak up about injuries, they don't do anything unless they're told, and they get conditioned to believe a robot. You know what I mean? I think that's the concern. So where is it's gray, but where is that line between and not?
Yeah, I think it's definitely gray, and not everyone will respond to the same kind of coaching methods or techniques or strategies. So with that in mind, I think where we need to be really careful is the cultural ideals and how they intensify the type of discipline that we hear so much now in the media, with gymnasts speaking out. A crucial point that you have also picked up in other podcasts is this idea that the gymnast needs to be a child, or needs to have a child body, or has a limited time frame to learning whatever she aims to learn, or whatever her capacity may be. So this idea that gymnastics is bound to childhood. If that is the understanding, and if that is the aim, to be successful within the time frame of of childhood, then while the gymnast is learning the skills, there's a risk for impatience or frustration from the side of the coach, because learning any movement skill is not straightforward. While it may be progressively built up in stages, and over a certain amount of time. We know how messy it can be in learning. You learn something, then it's not there anymore, or, you know, it doesn't move forward at all. Learning movement skills, as any learning, is not linear, constant.
Yep.
So, but if there is pressure, because the assumption is you need to have a certain thing in your routines or be able to perform in competition at a certain time, then that, to me, can be the point where the line is crossed. You must now do this, or there is a risk of abusive types of methods to enter the coaching context. Could be yelling, could be physical abuse, could be shaming in a way that we've heard, because it is assumed that learning can be linear, or because it's built up like this, it will be linear, but it is never. It's much more complex than that. So I think that is definitely one area where the line can be crossed.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it does. I think the idea you brought up that is very important is the false notion that gymnastics progression is linear and constant. And I think that's what trips a lot of people up. I think similar to, we talk to a lot of our athletes about how you don't move up in the levels one per year like you do academically. They assume that 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade. And so a lot of parents don't understand why their athlete may take 2 years at a certain level, like a compulsory level, to learn these things well. They get the fear in the sense that they're behind if they don't continuously linearly increase in their skill difficulty and their abilities. And like you said, if we drew a map of skill learning and progress in gymnastics, it's much more zigzags than it is a line. And I think that's what unfortunately serves as a point of frustration for many coaches, is coaches sometimes have the false notion that skill progression is directly linear, that as soon as you learn a back handspring, you have a back handspring book on your shelf that you can pull up and be perfect anytime. And then you learn a back layout, and then you learn a back full. And I think that's a really, really dangerous pressure to put on the athlete, that as soon as they have a skill, they have it forever. It will never go away, or as soon as they compete a certain level, they'll never go backwards. Like, there are so many factors that influence, you know, the zigzag approach to progression in gymnastics, whether it's technical development, whether it's fear, whether it's outside life stress, whether it's an injury. There are many things that influence why somebody may go backwards and forwards and sideways. And I think that's something that coaches really need to take to heart, is like, if someone is struggling with a skill they previously competed, or if someone is maybe very dedicated to a certain goal, but they grow up and their goals change and they don't have that same fervor and that same motivation to be that level or be in the sport at that age. We have to understand these things are fluid and they change, and we have to be accommodating to those, in the same way that if you were learning your own skill and you were frustrated, or you were starting a new job and you were frustrated with not being able to pick it up quickly, you wouldn't want your boss yelling at you all the time for why don't you learn this faster? Why aren't you, we went over this already. Why don't you have this done? Like, it's very hard to handle that. So I think it's a very important point you made about it's not linear, it's not constant, and there's many factors that are in play here.
But I mean, this has been my experience of observing coaches, having been a coach as well. Frustration is a real thing as a coach, and this can be on a daily basis, or a frustration and impatience perhaps also, or can also be a frustration. I know that she can do it, but it's not working now. It doesn't always have to be a frustration. Oh, she's not good enough. I kind of like it's quite natural to have these reactions to when things are not going so well. But we need to see it in relation to the context of how often we expect learning to take place, and also the time frame that is associated or idealized in gymnastics. That learning needs to be quick, learning needs to be constant, it needs to be progressive. And the reality is it's not. Even the most talented of athletes is not always learning or getting better. And certainly if there is a pressure to, time pressure or other type of pressure, then that can complicate things even further.
I have another follow-up question, if this is possibly helpful, is I couldn't agree more. And I've always thought this, but you completely outlined it so well, is it's amazing how many silent norms there are in our culture of sport that are not written, but they're just culturally followed. And I think this is a huge source of people's frustrations. I get emails and messages all the time from people that say, I listen to the podcast, I love it, I want to change, but the stubbornness of my gym and so set in their ways is so hard that nobody will even entertain a new idea or something different or not following what people did in the 80s, right? And so my question is, in your experience, where do these assumed or silent cultural norms come from? And Tim, you mentioned some really great factors, but within a local club community, where do these behaviors maybe come from? Is it the head coach's behavior? Is it the accepted norms of behaviors and stuff? Because I think that if we can understand where these cultural norms of you have to be small and skinny to be successful, you have to be quiet and listen to the coach at all times, never speak up, how to discipline somebody with punishment of conditioning, I think is something I really want to dive into. Where do these things come from? Because I think if we all understand as a culture and as a community where they come from, we can then have a conversation about how do we change them. So I guess the first part is, where do you feel these things come from and become so normalized in a gym's culture?
Yeah, I think the history of gymnastics can offer a certain amount of explanation. And there's lots of people who have commented on that in different kinds of avenues now about this change from the 1960s to the 1970s mainly, where quite a radical change in gymnastics or women's artistic gymnastics occurred in a relatively short time frame. And probably as gymnastics has never changed as much as then since. So from the Czaslavska era, where adult women were performing the types of exercises that they were performing, of course, this was also shaped by the type of apparatus that there was available at the time, to gymnastics becoming a child sport, or assumed a child sport, and Nadia Comaneci being the sort of key gymnast who demonstrated how this can be done and how successful this is. And with that, the coaching transformed in so many ways at that time. So in the Czaslavska era, it was also mainly women coaching. There wasn't as much training. It was not the same amount of training, also the same type of training. And of course, then it became this, I don't know whether I should name it like that, but this Carolee type of system of coaching. And while they were not the only ones that used this type of coaching, at least demonstrated globally, and when at the Montreal Olympic Games, when Nadia Comaneci was so successful, that this is the most successful way to do things in this sport. This spread very quickly, despite the Cold War curtain still being really real. People copied. There was, of course, also exchanges where people, as coaches on the other side of the curtain, could learn. But this became accepted as the truth or the norm, that kids need to be selected early on. They need to start very early on. They need to train a lot, and they need to train in a certain way. And the coach-gymnast relationship is in a certain way, with the coach being the authority and the knower, and the gymnast is the object that can be manipulated and taught and protected and made a star. So I do think that history has a lot to say for the complete normalization of the type of gymnastics or the type of practices in gymnastics that we know of. And to this day, I mean, with the gymnasts speaking out, there is quite a commentary that counters this, saying, yeah, but this needs to be like this. This is the only way that this can be done, and get over it. This is elite sport and elite gymnastics, certainly. So we do see in those commentaries also how deep-seated this understanding is, even though no psychologist or any other therapist or counselor would agree that these types of methods are performance enhancing or good for individuals. And certainly they are not practiced in any other context, because it's illegal or like you can't.
Yeah.
I'm talking girls, mainly school, for instance. So to get children to perform in school, you don't scream at them, you don't adopt any types of practices like this. Yet in many elite sport contexts, not just gymnastics, it seems to be completely accepted. Even though sport right from the IOC, so the Olympic Committee, to sport-specific federations, to national federations, they all have policies and charters that are human rights. They reflect those human rights or children's rights,
Yep.
or other ethical principles.
Yep.
Those documents exist, and yet still it seems to be okay for coaches and others to do what we have for many years heard that is going on.
Yeah, it's I agree, and it's very interesting you said that. I think when you look at, especially if you listen to like the 30 for 30 podcast and some other very well detailed,
Yes.
again, not just the curlies, but just the era of coaching that was around. It almost, to me, just feels like it was a blind assumption. It didn't really feel like a conversation. It just felt like this is how it is. Like snap of a finger. You have to be very aggressive and train long hours and get them when they're 10, 12 years old. They have to dedicate their whole life to this. You know, that's the only way it's successful. And it's really interesting because this is one of the blessings, I think, of the internet and of social media and of awareness now, is that one of the things that is so mind-boggling to me is the percentages of positive experiences and positive outcomes to negative that came out of maybe that 10 to 20 year bracket of coaching. How many kids and athletes came out of the other side of successful in terms of performance, but they also were mentally and healthy on the other side of their sport career? The percentage of those Nadias and other people who made it, quote unquote, to the massive 10 to 15 times ratio of athletes who burnt out or were hurt. And when they were hurt, just brushed to the side and said, okay, who's next? The volume of gymnasts that they were able to pull allowed this, only this discounting the negatives and only looking at the positives. Like, look at all the shining examples of things that are going well. And in reality, the percentages of differences between positive was an iceberg. It was an iceberg of positive results and positive outcomes to a just absolute host of negative behind the scenes that nobody saw. And I think in that era of the 80s and 90s, there was no internet, there was no social media. So a lot of those people just got swept under the rug, or if somebody spoke out against them, they were very quickly, discredited. We've seen many persons. So that was one. But the other is, this is a classic example of correlation and not causation, right? There was this, it was correlated that these methods equaled success, right? Or that it was caused, like their curly way and that approach to coaching caused directly the success. Not thinking about maybe these athletes were just incredible athletes who were super durable and mentally just willing to withstand such ridiculous training hours. And it was a correlation, not a causation. And if you looked more in depth at those metrics, you'd probably find that a lot of the cases were not directly as a result. They were in despite of that, not because of that. And so now we're seeing that more, is that, wow, there's 5 or 6 examples of someone who was treated well, developed later in the year, has a very different physique and body type, is competing in their mid-20s, is getting better after the age of 18, is getting better with more time off and relative work to rest. And that's what we're seeing now, is because of social media, because of the internet, and because of amazing works like Athlete A and everybody else's research, we're seeing like, oh my goodness, there is an incredibly different way that can happen. And you look back at those early years, you go, oh, what have we done? What in the world have we allowed to happen? I think that's the process of unfortunate realization we're living through in the era right now. So I don't know. I don't know if I said anything productive there, but this is my thought right now.
But a comment that I wanted to make is that a question that I hear often, and I'm asked that same question as well, is, so if we don't follow that protocol of the Caroli protocol, for lack of a better term, then that would mean that we take ourselves away from the competitive level of gymnastics.
Yep.
So at a national level, that means that we will never go to the Olympic Games. There doesn't seem to be an alternative vision for how this can be possible, even though we see gymnasts now being older and enhancing their performance beyond the age of 18 and so on. There still doesn't seem to be a widespread vision that this can be done otherwise. Yep. I think some individuals would provide this vision, but it's not strong enough still to counter that deep-seated belief that we need to do it in this traditional way, or gymnastics success can only be achieved through abusive types of methods. I'm not sure why the gymnastics community as well has such a problem to accept or to see that it can be done in a different way. It's astonishing how people hold on to this, but this is elite sport. It needs to be punishing and it needs to be horrible and hard, and you need to come out with a broken body at the end. Otherwise, it doesn't even count as elite, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's really impressive that, sorry not to interrupt, but it's impressive how strong the fear of the unknown is for the sport of gymnastics. The fear of change, the fear of social judgment for being that one club or gym that goes radically in a different direction. And also just the fear of missing the shot, as you said. I think so many people are paralyzed by what's on the other side of trying something so radically different. And it's really, when I look at it from the medical lens and my coaching lens and the research that we're doing on maybe like the concept of long-term athletic development, I don't think we've ever actually entertained the complete opposite model of what we've done for 30, 40 years in gymnastics, which is not specializing so early, going for a longer term athletic development, using science as a solid base behind training methods, and then also collaboration, right? And interdisciplinary care of not asking a coach to do everything, of be all these different these hats. I think that if we were to collectively as a sport say we're going to try something radically different, even if that means a year or 2 years not having competitive success and positive outcomes on those metric scales, it would be really, really wild to see what happens when we use science and we try that longer term model. We don't ask kids here in the States to be recruited or eligible for college scholarships around 13 or 14 years old, and instead 16 years old. I think it would be extremely impressive to see the positive results that come from that. But in my opinion, I don't think anyone's ever really done that in a full long-term career scale, because everyone is afraid to take that first jump off the cliff because they don't want to miss their shot. Parents who are in their ear about my daughter needs a scholarship or we want to move up in level. Like it's so complex and there's so many wrapped up factors. But that's my opinion of really, it comes down to the fear of the unknown, of what's on the other side of that door. The fear of changing. It's a lot of work to change. And also the fear of social ridicule. I think a lot of coaches worry that if they go to a meet and don't have those little like 8-year-old, 10-year-old rocket stars that be judged and mocked for their decisions. And that takes a lot of value, moral compass and integrity from your own self, of sense of worth and your sense of values, to stand up against a system that's built around cultural norms that are so strong as we have.
Absolutely. I agree. And I think maybe gymnastics is right in that phase now, that perhaps now with what's been going on, people will be more prepared to jump through that hoop or go through that door to say, okay, we are not going to do this anymore. We're going to do it like this, so that perhaps if we were to have a discussion again in 10 years, we would look back and say, oh no, we were at this turnoff and now we can see some differences since then. I wish for that, because I'm convinced that elite gymnastics doesn't need to be the way it now, and you've had Simone Biles, previous coach, on your podcast.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry for not remembering your names. That there will be more of those types of coaches. I'm sure that there are coaches like this, but they're perhaps not. They haven't had the privilege of such a successful athlete, so that they are well known globally for having worked differently. Right. But that we see more of those examples at the highest level of gymnastics, who can confirm to the gymnastics community in a similar way that Bella Caroli with Nadia Comaneci did in 1976, that, look, now we can have a paradigm shift again. I saw that quicker type of change into a more ethically acceptable type of coaching, training, but also organization of gymnastics, because it's not only coaches who to change, it's also gymnastics organizations that need to transform so that this type of abusive behavior doesn't happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I'm glad you said that about Amy and stuff, because for me personally, and I guess I'll pose this question to you after, is what do we do about it? Maybe what do we do about change, and how do we actually get something more positive and different? I really think that one of the only ways to help people is to give them another positive example to follow. And I have a lot of empathy for coaches, and I am glad that I spent the last 20 years coaching, because it's very hard to coach years, right? Like, I have a lot of empathy towards the frustrations they face, trying to motivate athletes, trying to get them to progress in such a challenging world, especially right now in a pandemic. And I think people desperately need someone to say, one, here is a positive example to follow. Here's what Nick Ruddick did. Here's what Amy did. Here's what all these amazing coaches did. And I'm fortunate that I can have some of these people on the podcast so we can learn from them. But it's not only about this is what's wrong, don't do this, but also people are saying, okay, well, tell me what to do. Help me. You don't help me understand what I can do differently. How do I deal with these teenagers who are very emotional sometimes? How do I deal with these very challenging skills to teach? And I think that's what we need to try to pivot towards, is lifting up the positive examples of coaches on social media, and not only constantly bashing the things that are going wrong. That's important to highlight, but being able to be empathetic and communicate with coaches about, what do you face as a problem? How can I help you? What are the things you struggle with the most? And then as an organization, as leaders, as gym owners, as a head coach, hearing what your staff is struggling with, or hearing what the complaints are, and saying, okay, who can I talk to? What can I learn from? How can I get this, as something I can help somebody with? That, I think, turns the pivot wheel in towards a collaborative effort to, okay, let's work together and fix this. We realize this is not working well. And I think that raw, radical amount of candor and communication about the real problems that people have is what we're really trying to move towards. And for me, that's the only way I see out of this problem, along with organizations transforming and being more stern to hold those accountable who are, let's be honest, just slipping through the cracks of still being abusive and still treating kids poorly. I get messages all the time from people who are saying, I've tried so hard to report this. I've tried so hard to speak up, but all I do is get gossip about me, and they make fun of me, and they say you're weak, and they say you're not tough enough. So it's still a very real problem that people are facing with coaches who are acting unethically. And so we governing bodies to have reporting systems, but for the ground level, we need to educate coaches on a better way to do it. We need to give them a positive example to follow. We need to listen to their concerns instead of just making this a constant, you are doing things all wrong and you're never going to do it. Like, there's so many good examples of people to follow that we need to promote. And so that's my opinion. But what do you feel are ways to move out of these cultural silent norms that are so, immoral sometimes, unfortunately?
You mean on a bigger scale?
However you feel is beneficial.
Yeah. I mean, I think having been heavily involved in coach education, that's got to go a long way, or some way. Perhaps requires a generational shift at some point.
Yeah.
As perhaps it's easier to teach younger coaches who haven't been in the system for so long than perhaps coaches who've got lots of experience doing something in a certain way. I would suggest that talking about the inbuilt discipline, or the inherent disciplinary nature of elite sport, or sport in general, how through very simple coaching strategies this can be not countered, but perhaps the effect isn't as strong. Looking here, just to be very practical now, also is, you mentioned this earlier on, to have the gymnast autonomy, or to control something by herself in the gym, with this spatial organization where coaches can see everything very easily all the time. And a possibility is for gymnasts to do stuff unobserved, or at least given the task, or you do this at this station over there, I'm not looking, I'm trusting you that you do this properly. This doesn't need to be something that is dangerous, but this can be easily built into for the younger gymnasts as well as the older ones. Gymnasts are not usually mucking around in the gym. They're usually very diligent people. They want to do things right. So there's no need to not trust these individuals. That's a simple way of building in something that allows autonomy or agency, or asking lots of questions. I believe you've discussed this also with Nick Ruddick. But to me, that's also something simple enough. So how did the skill feel? What do you think you need to do now because it's not working yet? or at the end of a training session, how do you evaluate the training session? What do you want to do better tomorrow or the next time? Or at the beginning, is there something specific today? We're going to have this type of training. What do you want to do on vault? What do you want to achieve or improve on vault? I mean, this is not groundbreaking science, and I know that lots of coaches do this type of stuff, but to me, it counters some of those disciplinary effects that formal sport has built in. To me, it could also help to have the space open.
Sure.
For people to come in. Or one space that I observed for a long time, the changing rooms, or the gymnasts didn't have any changing rooms, the lockers were also in this open space. So even there, the coaches could observe what they were doing. So there literally was no privacy or space given to the gymnasts. That, to me, could also counter some of that all-encompassing control that coaches have, is to allow gymnasts their own space.
Yep.
If that is possible. Yeah, in terms of learning gymnastics skill in the proper technique that is expected, so that it doesn't lead to deductions, that's perhaps a bit more difficult. There isn't so much wriggle room there, but this can be also communicated that, okay, here that we can't discuss it. This is how you've got to do it. There are reasons for this, and there are X, Y. But there are perhaps other ways to bring in creativity or play into a training session, even at the highest level. I mean, I'm sure that coaches have got plenty of ideas how that is possible. To me, those are some actions, and there's loads of others that can lighten up this disciplinary effect that I think are so hidden or taken for granted, but they are real.
Yeah, and they have a big effect too. I would agree. I think especially like on the technical part of it, which is oftentimes the trickiest one to navigate, is you can still kind of say these are the necessary technical things you have to do well to be safe and to perform well and to build a good basics foundation for later. But there's a very big difference between just blindly instructing the athlete to do those things because you said so, and doing the opposite, which is educating them on why they need to do that. Why do I need to arms here? Why do I need to tap at a certain time? Why do I have to do these weird drills on the side that I don't want to do? The more you educate the athlete on the technical piece of it, they become a part of the active process of learning instead of just listening and following orders, right? I think that's a very important. It's easy as a coach to fall into that rut, even if it's not intentionally malicious, as many coaches are. They just kind of get in a rhythm of like, watch a turn, make a correction, watch a turn, make a correction. Instead, sometimes being okay with giving up a couple minutes of awkward critical thinking skills where you're like, well, this happened last night on vault. This young athlete was learning Yurchenko, and she went straight up. I was like, well, why do you think that happened? You know, what do you think makes you go up versus back? And she was like, I don't know. What do you think? I was like, well, I'm asking you. And I was like, what about your hips? What about where your arms are? And it was just like this process of critical thinking for her, so that when she goes to a drill, she can think through on her own, why am I doing this? What's happening? Why am I not? Instead of just going through the motions over and over. So I think that's very important. I think you said input to assignments is really important. Like, hey, we have to condition. I know it's not the most thing in the world, but here's all the exercises we have to try to get to. Do you want to do this in a circuit? Should we do this together as a team? Do you want to do this at stations? I think those little like pieces of autonomy where they can drive the bus a little bit is very important. And the last thing I want to kind of summarize and make sure we talk about here, because I know this is going to come up in 100 emails, is one of the best ways to change the authoritarian or disciplinary norm that maybe not be great in your gym is to 100% get rid of using conditioning as punishment. I think
for sure.
that is something that is, again, some people aren't maliciously doing this. Some people are, unfortunately, but they have grown up in a culture where if you fall off beam or you miss a skill, you go do rope climbs. If you talk back, you do push-ups, right? And like that kind of stuff. And I think that we in our gym are very firm on conditioning is never a positive nor a negative reinforcement, because we view it as this is a necessary uncomfortable, challenging part of the sport that is a part of moving towards your goals and being disciplined for yourself and being in control of your own gymnastics. And you are the one that is in the story as the hero. I am helping you. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to do things that aren't fun and aren't exciting, like boring basics or conditioning. So we never have you fell, go do rope climbs, or you fell, do push-ups. We also don't have, if I do this right, can I get out of conditioning, right? If we make enough skills or we make routines as a team, can we not do our cardio together? I think both of those things remove it from the, not a chore, but an uncomfortable part of the sport that you have to kind of work through. And it puts it in the bag of like, you're bidding and you're bargaining with your conditioning. So we're very firm on that instead of punishing somebody for falling or something of that nature, we try to talk to them and communicate about that. And especially with someone's not doing drills, someone's not motivated, someone is talking maybe when it's their turn, they're maybe too chatty in the chalk bucket. We would rather calmly talk to them about, hey, is everything okay? Do I need to clarify the assignment? Is there a reason why you guys are not maybe productive as possible? And I get it, in a pandemic, it's a very social experience in the gym, but treating those things with honest communication and saying, hey, listen, it's very frustrating for me as a coach and us as a coaching staff when I build all these drills and I try to make these practice plans, and then we only have 45 minutes on this event, and there's a lot of side talk and there's a lot of, maybe wasted opportunities to get better. I'm trying to help you reach your goals. So the route of communication and explaining and trying to build accountability into their own self of gymnastics is a much, much better option long-term punishment as conditioning. So I would love to hear your thoughts on anything related to the conditioning as punishment discussion.
To me, this is an outdated concept that was used in education, for instance, as well. You were punished for performance or something. And in terms of sport, if conditioning as a strength training is used as a form of punishment, it actually, the athlete comes to associate the strength training as with something bad. I had to do it because I was wrong.
Yep.
And I mean, if a gymnast falls off the beam or the bars when she does a certain skill and is being punished for it, there's probably a reason for why she fell off or couldn't do the skill as she's supposed to do. It's not because she slacked off or because she was misbehaving, punishment is usually associated with that. Not being able to perform according to expectation, that might be a technical error, cannot be punished because it's not that type of mistake that is punishable. It's something that has to do with learning a skill. I would also say that if that's the reaction, then it reinforces to the gymnast that I'm bad or that I'm a bad person or that I'm not good enough and I'm being punished for it. So, I mean, falling off is probably already a sign to the gymnast, perhaps even in the form of punishment as such. It doesn't need to be punished further. What she needs is actually help. By the punishment is probably unlikely to make it better.
Yeah,
It's going to make it a lot better, a lot worse, because the gymnast is going to also seek the mistake in herself rather than perhaps the build-up she's had, or perhaps she's stressed, or she's got fear or something. But to me, that's a very outdated way of doing pedagogy, which is what coaches do. They do pedagogical work. To me, it makes absolutely no sense. And I'm sure that lots of people who've researched pedagogy or education would also agree with that. Yeah, I know in physical education in school that used to be something that was used, and now it's completely not okay, and for good reasons for why this type of treatment cannot be used in class.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think there's in my mind, there's really two categories here of where this comes up the most, one of which being with the skill acquisition, as we're talking about here. And then another is with disciplinary or behavioral, motivation, talking back. And I think there's a really good example of the difference here is Paul Sargison, who's an elite men's coach here. When he was on the podcast, he mentioned this. He was saying that when somebody falls on a skill or somebody maybe misses a routine, the conversation they have is that we're going to do some extra drills or do some extra physical preparation, not as a punishment, but because clearly we have some opportunity to get better here. This is an issue technically, or an issue in your strength or your cardiovascular endurance that we have to work on here for you to be successful. So he frames these things all the time as, if you say, for example, are doing a parallel bar endurance routine and you fall apart at the end, you might have to go do some push-ups or an endurance set elsewhere, not as a punishment, but because this is showing us we have to get better here. And so they have a very different, unique relationship with why they're doing some more work after. It's not a public shaming. It's not an embarrassment. It's not a you're not good enough or something of that nature. And then the other side of the fence is the disciplinary side of maybe disrespect or something of that. And instead of having that instant reflexive, you're maybe being disrespectful towards me, go climb the rope, you have to have a conversation with them about, hey, listen, I understand that maybe you're not having the best day, or you're frustrated, or you want to talk to your friends, but your actions right now are not in line with our cultural, acceptance that we agreed upon trust and respect, a good teammate and being a good human. The most important thing in both of those is that you are critiquing the person's behavior, not the person, right? You are critiquing their actions and their choices about, okay, you made an error. This is not how we act towards each other. This is a mutual respect. Or, hey, your parallel bar set needs some work. Let's work on something to get you better. That's very different than your gymnastics is not good enough. You're not good enough. Go climb the rope. Or you're being disrespectful, or you're being, you know what I mean? It's very different. So you have to be willing to have those conversations and improve your communication skills to explain why you are using something like that as a productive solution to something else. On the behavior side, you often talk about, hey, are you okay? Are things all right? Because this isn't normally how you act and you're having a little bit of a hard day. Can I help you in any way? Do you need to take a walk? Should we change the assignment? Is this not happening today? And then if someone continues to be disrespectful or distract the practice, you say, hey, listen, this is not going to be okay. This is not how we have only limited amount of time here. We have to work on practice productively. I'm going to give you the option to change the way you're acting, or we're going to have something else. Maybe we're going to we're not going to do this event, or I might have to call your mom and have a conversation because this right now is maybe not appropriate for the way we should act in the gym. So a long answer, but I know coaches have that in their mind.
Well, I mean, I think it's much easier, easier in apostrophes, to just say you need to do strength training and actually have those more difficult conversations that are time consuming, that might take your time away from coaching others. Maybe, after the training session, you do have to talk to a parent, that's cumbersome. But at the end of the day, it's going to be more productive, and it's not going to have that undesired effect on the athlete long term. So it's the responsibility of the coaches to do those, to react in the appropriate way.
Yeah. And I guess I'll wrap things up on this point, is saying that you have to remember that the present cultural climate of your gym and what's accepted as norms is the product of all of the choices you've made leading up to that day. So if you're living in a gym that is not the best to be a part of, and you're not happy with the resentment that you can feel in the air between the coaches and the athletes, the reason is because of a lot of choices and days of decisions making up to that. So if you want to change the future, you have to be willing to do that harder thing, have that harder conversation, embrace new ideas to then build the foundation for moving forward. And I always hear about this with coaches that are maybe lacking some self-awareness here, is some athlete is having pain or an injury and they don't, want to speak up about it. And the coach, finally something happens, they go to a medical provider, they go to a physical therapist, and they get upset with me or with the athlete. Like, why did you go to the PT, or why did you go to the medical provider? Why didn't you just tell me? Well, they didn't tell you because you, over thousands of micro interactions, created a space where they didn't feel comfortable to talk about their injuries. Because when it started 2 weeks ago, you said like, oh, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. Just go do some drills, right? Or like, oh God, you were annoyed that they had, realizing that all of those interactions of writing off their complaints or not listening to them was led to the situation where they didn't feel comfortable. They were scared of what you were going to say to them. They were scared of social judgment. So they didn't talk about their shin hurting, and now it's a stress fracture, right? And now on the other side of it, when it comes back around, coaches get upset about like, why didn't you tell me? Or, oh, we take 6 weeks off. It's like, well, choices and actions have consequences. So if you don't want to have this happen again, have some introspection and realize that maybe I should take things more seriously the first time they kind of complain. maybe I should have a conversation with them instead of just saying, oh, you're just being lazy, or it's a mental thing and you're not tough enough. Just write them off quickly. So a small another point on the medical side.
Yes.
I think this has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm conscious of your time. I don't want to take up, I know you're very busy, but is there anything else, Natalie, that you feel is important to note, or there's other things if you had a magic bulletin board for the world to hear, are there any messages that you wish the world of gymnastics could hear?
It's a big question.
I know, a thinker.
Yeah, I mean, building on today's topic, I think that in any sport or anything, that any social context that we participate in, that there are a lot of hidden aspects that we are not aware of. And I think I would encourage coaches in this particular situation that we're talking about to be a bit self-critical, or to question some of those taken for granted aspects or practices, or to take them very seriously, because they have consequences, and they can also be prevented or made otherwise useful than this productivity that we see in terms of disciplined athletes or robot athletes, which of course is very it's very comfortable or very straightforward if you have gymnasts who don't say peep and do what you ask them to do. But perhaps that's also ethically that's not right. To me, that's not coaching. To me, that's drilling, or it's manipulation. But coaching can be so much more rewarding if you are a bit more creative or playful, or you actually try to have the positive impact that you can have on the athlete. That's a nice thing. And the performance will come. Also, that doesn't exclude that. To me, coaching is difficult. It's also an intellectually challenging activity, but to me, that's also where the reward is, not the sort of yelling authoritarian type of coaching. I don't know how that can be rewarding to be like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good end now.
No, it's perfect. It's a perfect way to end the podcast, because I can tell you for a fact that as someone who's been through it, and as someone who is very fortunate to work and consult with a lot of programs here in the States and around the world, that people are much happier and more productive and more successful when they are willing to have those hard conversations and embrace some of those challenging things. Like we talk a lot about those silent kind of assumptions and norms. Well, the easiest way to make them not silent is to talk about them directly and not dance around that elephant in the room, so to speak, but really ask, what are the problems here? What do you guys think are things need to change? What am I doing that I should do better? Or what are some things that I feel internally that are frustrating for me? Like I talked about with that example of, drills and motivation. And it's like asking the athletes, why don't you want to do the drills? Why do you always leave early when we try to do conditioning? Why are you casually coming late to practice? What's going on here? Versus just looking the other way conveniently because that conversation is hard. I promise you that a lot of resentment goes away and a lot of happiness increases. When you have psychological safety in your network to talk about these things head on, and everybody's happier on the other side of it. So that would just be my parting thoughts.
Very good.
Yes, Natalie, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. We will get this put up pretty quickly, and we look forward to everybody having some great feedback about this.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I hope you have a wonderful day.
I will. Thank you. You too.